to give context to what's going on here, we need to talk about colonialism a little bit. We'll talk about this more later in the semester. So colonialism is basically when a powerful nation exercises control over other lands and people. And when this happens, colonized people respond in a wide variety of ways, but most often they resist. They fight back. They don't want to be controlled by the nation that's coming in, and often trying to take their resources, take their people, exploit them in various ways. This is, of course, what happened with America, right? Britain was the colonial power that controlled the European peoples in the US, and they fought back. They had a revolution, American Revolution, and got independence. And people around the world have responded in similar ways. So this is how the Iranian revolutionaries saw their situation. They saw the Shah as being a puppet of the US, as being a essentially colonial leader, and they fought back. In 1979 there were demonstrations, there was fighting on the streets with the police. Ayatollah Khomeini returned, there was a big celebration and fights, and eventually the military abandoned the Shah, and at which point he lost power. The monarchy was overturned, and they wrote a new constitution. Now this was a collaborative group of many different types of revolutionaries, pro-democracy, communist, etc., but the Islamic faction was the most organized, the most effective, and they got to heavily shape the constitution. And they created the country that exists today, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Khomeini was the supreme leader, and in the book, If You Could Be Mine, she refers to him as Angry Grandpa. You can see him depicted here in the pictures that she sees in the classrooms. They're in every classroom in Iran. Of course, she'd never say that out loud. She'd get in all sorts of trouble, but that's how she describes it in her head. And in this system, the Islamic jurists, so judges who are clerics, are called guardians, and they ultimately have control. They can overturn any law that they think goes against their understanding of Islam. But there's also a democratic president and a parliament who are elected, and they have a lot of control over various aspects of the government. The things that the Islamic jurists don't care about or feel are allowable within Islam, they allow the democratic institutions to make their own decisions about. In 1979 to 1981, there was the hostage crisis. If you've seen the movie Argo, it depicts that, and the US and Iran started to fight each other. This became very convenient for Ronald Reagan, who was the president of the US at the time, to have this, fight with Iran, and it was convenient for Khomeini. They both were more powerful in their country because they could have this enemy, right? He described the US as the Great Satan, famously, and formed an alliance with the USSR, the Soviet Union. And he started to kill his ex-allies or eliminate them, push them out of office, out of power, until it was just an Islamic government. In the 1980s, there was a massive war with Iraq. It was 8 years long. It was a horrible war. Many, many people died on both sides. Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons during the war. He was the leader of the leader of Iraq, supported by the US. In fact, the US used satellites to allow him to target his chemical weapons. And during this time, Khomeini was authoritarian. He massacred enemies. In 1989, Khomeini dies, and Ayatollah Khamenei, no relation, just similar names, becomes his successor. This is the man that she describes as disappointed grandpa. And there's a period of stabilization. He still has the same power that Khomeini did, but he doesn't exercise it quite as violently. He doesn't need to. Many of the enemies have already been eliminated. And during this time, there's more of a focus on democratic politics. One of the ways we can judge if a country is really a democracy is if different factions succeed and get elected. If we can see changes in policy as a result in changes in voter wishes, and we definitely see that in Iran. We see, more conservative, more liberal presidents being elected in parliaments and implementing different policies as a result of it, but it's all ultimately constrained by the religious theocracy, the leaders. So you have this interesting dual system that is both a theocracy, a religious rule, and a democracy, ruled by the people. But there's still a limit to how far he will allow the democracy to have flexibility. And in 2009, there were protests, known sometimes as the Green Revolution, and he responded with violence and put down the protests because that was going too far against his power.